much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shindell or Dr. Al-Azim, what are the legal privacy laws that would impede us in our ability to dealing with the art dealers, the financial institutions, auction houses, insurance companies, and transfer of information and suspicious activity? What can we do in that regard?
I don't think the problem is the current state of the privacy laws, but rather getting the core information to then provide what the industry would refer to as curated, privacy-protected information. So if we go back to the example I used a minute ago of the bank loan scenario where there were now a means to associate a series of transactions around the world that were the same assets to provide a response back to the current financial institution, that would then trigger the AML suspicious activity reporting regime and all the privacy issues around that with law enforcement. So what would then happen is the system would know there's suspicious activity around these particular objects that are being used potentially for some problem or another, whether it's trade-based money laundering or terrorist financing. And then the system we have in place would trigger under its existing rules and regulations. So I don't think we need a change in what's private or not, but organizing the information to provide curated, privacy-protected, but effective information for intervening.
Thank you. So this deals mostly with just the transfer of information that would be compatible, that they would have the access to certain data?
Correct, from a high level. So you would know, the bank would know, for example, the objects are at risk. They would then have the information they've
Everybody has
received.
access to the same data. Thank you.
Yeah.
Targeted sanctions. Give me some insight into that, how we would address that, considering the middlemen and private collectors. I mean, they don't have anything to do with ISIS, but how would we impose sanctions?
Well, I think sanctions could be imposed on the import. In other words, antiquities from Syria should be listed on the sanctions list. OFAC has been asked twice that I know of to do that and has so far refused to do so. If I could go back for just a moment to the last question also.
Certainly.
There is a great deal of secrecy. Buyers and sellers, the name of a seller is never made public when sold through an auction house. There are agency and fiduciary agreements with the auction house. Those names are not public. It would require a court order and a court process to get the name of a seller. The buyers frequently are also not made public. Things are sold through the internet without names at all. So I think there's a huge amount of secrecy. Maybe I'm looking at it on a more micro scale than Mr. Shindell is.
Well, it's a real scale. I appreciate hearing
But
that.
I think there's a lot that could be done that would require that kind of information.
Thank you.
I would just add that most of the material coming on, actually coming out of the ground right now is not even making the market. It's just being sold, transacted between dealers, and it never sees the main market. So most of this is actually academic when it comes to material currently being looted.
If you wish, I could clarify the privacy item
Yes, sir.
a bit
Please
further.
do. We'd like to know if it's necessary for it to be public for law enforcement to be engaged in it.
So as a title insurance company, we function as the safe haven or safe harbor where the information that's kept secret market-wise is disclosed to us under confidentiality provisions because we need to have that transparency to do our job. And that information only becomes relevant if there in fact is a problem or suspicious activity, and that becomes the information sharing element under the BSA, for example. So we would agree the industry in many respects operates for privacy reasons, many of which are legitimate, many of which are not, and that can be managed, but it's not as though the industry, from our standpoint,
Thank you very, very much. Talk to me some more about money laundering and the art trade and what can be done there to address that issue.
I believe that this is something like a bridge. Militarily, to take a bridge, you have to take it from both ends. So obviously there's the buying end or the demand end, but there's also the supply end. And I can really only speak to you on the supply side because that's the side I speak to and that's the side I work with. Really, the best thing we can do right now is to try and document as much as possible what is coming out of the ground, and that is really a huge task, and that is what we are focused on. Our problem then is how do we then manage to pass this information on, what mechanisms are available to us in terms of being able to share this information, and more importantly, how that information is then used to pursue or retrieve at some point, or even interject to prevent further transactions.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.